So hello everybody. I guess I'll kind of pseudo mod. Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming to AmazingCon. Thank you for joining us this weekend. This panel is World Building 101, one of I think 3 or 4 world building panels because there's so many of us in science fiction and fantasy who have to world build. So we have a lot to say. So the panelists are going to go around and introduce themselves and explain why they're on this panel to begin with. So Kathy, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm actually a retired NASA person. My mission, I was a science team member for Genesis, and that was the mission that went out, got solar wind, and brought it back. I was also a faculty member. And so that's my science cred. And so when it comes to world building, I've actually done the real calculations. So I'm the person to ask if you have questions. And then the next thing is that now I'm retired, I'm writing science fiction, and I just sold my 18th short story. So, yay.
Bud?
I'm Bud Sparhawk. I short story writer primarily, although I've got about 4 or 5 novels out there too somewhere. Been writing short stories for analog since Christ, I can't even remember, 66, 67, somewhere in there. But I took a 13-year hiatus and didn't start rewriting until 92. And I've been selling 3 or 4 stories a year ever since. So I've got a bunch of short stories in there. So I've built a lot of worlds. I've built a universe, in fact.
Bravo. Scott?
Okay, well, I'm also probably better known for short stories. I've been writing since 98, but took a hiatus until about 2014. And I've been publishing about 4 or 5 short stories a year since then. Also 2 novels out. One is in the current SIFWA Fantastic Beasts bundle called All Things Huge and Hideous, and basically it's about Sauron's veterinarian. And he has a tough life. Then also I have one sort of a Heinlein Juviesque novel called The Girl Who Wasn't There, available on Amazon. So I'm interested in world building because I've done both from the science fiction and the fantasy section, and frankly, it's probably the part of my writing that I've gotten the most compliments about.
Nice. And I'm J.M. Frey. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer as well, obviously. I have 9 novels currently published. I have about a dozen short stories. I'm also a screenwriter, so feature films and that kind of stuff. So there's lots of world building there as well. In terms of world building, my worlds are usually alternate universes, places with complete different geography. The biggest world build I had to do was for the Accidental Turn series, which is an epic fantasy series about epic fantasy series, where the characters in the epic fantasy series find out that they're characters in an epic fantasy series, escape the epic fantasy series, and confront the author who created the epic fantasy series. So there's a lot of world building in there. So that's why I'm on this panel. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I guess my first question in terms of world building is, once you've figured out the story and once you've figured out who your protagonist is, what's the very first thing you guys do when you have to build a whole world?
Well, for me, because I'm a planetary geologist, I make the planet.
So you start with like
well, I can start with character. It's always character first for me because my stories are character driven.
Mm-hmm.
But then I want to know where they are. And then from that point, I start with the planet and I literally build up from there. And one of my pet peeves, as I mentioned in a different panel, is that people forget that it's a world. And I want people to remember that there's elevation, you have different biomes, maybe you have oceans, maybe you don't, but I want people to remember that it's a whole world. And no, your story can maybe just about one place on your world, but still as the author, I want you to know what the whole world is like, weather, everything. And that's what I like. And that's what I really enjoy when I read a story. And it may only be one line because it could be a short story, but I can tell it's so rich that this person, that this author thought about all those things, even if they don't get in the story.
Mm-hmm.
You mean
if I could
start
spring
off with the line, oh, excuse me.
that, I was going to say, if I could springboard off that, see, in the mundane law, I'm a history teacher. So you start with geography. I tend to start with history, and say, okay, if we have this society, if we have this character, where did they come from? Why is this society the way it is? And that's my pet peeve, because I've seen some very gifted writers, especially in short stories, who will set up this, like, even in the horror shows, like, well, there's this curse and it afflicts people. I'm like, okay, literally, how could that possibly have started? There's no, for example, the movie It Follows. This thing follows you. How did the first person ever find that out before they got killed?
And how do they tell anyone else?
Right.
Thank
Okay.
you.
So anyway, sorry, bud. Thank you.
I was going to say, you could start off the story with, it was night on the planet and it was snowing. Yeah, the generality, starting off with a generality generally leads to my madness. I generally start off with some sort of scientific premise. For example, I just came off my writers group. We had our review session today, and I wrote a short story where I thought, why not make the entire time continuum broken up into neighborhoods, and then have a cataclysm that ended each neighborhood, and then have the human beings that then colonized each of the 6 of the surviving neighborhoods. Getting that concept across was the hardest part of writing this story. And I developed quite a bit of background information, I guess, and all first, and then kind of built on that and say, what would happen? Is the fauna going to survive the cataclysm? How will it change? Or is the vegetation going to change? How is it going to change? What's the process of evolution that's going to go from here, 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 here? How would you deal with that? And all this stuff is in the background. I'm trying to write a short story. So I got a 7,000 word short story, and the writers group said, why didn't you expand on this? Why didn't you expand on that? Why didn't you expand?
Because it's a short story.
They're all freaking novelists, garrulous bastards. And I'm a short story writer, and I'm trying to get this thing down into 7,000 words. And they're giving me a novel's worth of suggestions. So yeah.
Maybe this one's a novel.
You basically start off with the premise, and then you populate the premise.
Yeah. For me, it's once I know who my protagonist is and how I need to massage the world to fit the story that I need them to experience. I have a master's degree in sociology, so or communications culture with a focus on sociology and online tribes. So for me, the first thing I think of is how do they swear? Because if I know how they swear, then I know what they blaspheme. If I know what they blaspheme, then I know what they hold holy. If I know what they hold holy, then I know the rhythm of their lives and their beliefs and their worship. And I'm not saying it has to be a religion. It doesn't have to be worship. It could be whatever else we're doing in lieu of that, community building and stuff like that. And for me, that makes it a lot easier, because it's like, well, if this is how they're going to swear, and this is a blasphemy of that, then I know that this is how their days are ordered. This is what their society rhythms are. This is what power the different genders have. And then I can build out from there. And I actually, I have a big checklist that I fill out, and it's like a PowerPoint that I made a couple of years ago for a workshop, and it's 60 some odd slides. And it's questions like, where do their textiles come from? What's the staple grain? What's the weather like in the summer? What's the weather like in the winter? Things like that. And I go through that and I make that up. And then I take that whole thing and I shove it in a drawer.
Right.
And I don't put it on the page.
Absolutely.
I
Thank
put
you.
information on the page, but I don't stop the narrative. It's science fiction, but fiction's the most important part of that. Don't stop the narrative to tell me how clever you are as a writer and all these. Only Tolkien can do Tolkien.
Thank you for that. That's really important to me too. I hate that when we get into the data dump. And even though I love your world, and yes, I even love Dune, but Dune is also Dune. You can't do somebody else.
Yeah.
And also, if it's already been done, you say, well, so and so did it. Well, yeah, it's been done. So find a way of making a balance that is you. So that's another piece of advice I would give writers.
Yeah.
And that is, who are you and what do you find interesting? And go with that. Now,
I'm just going to jump on
don't
that real
do
quick.
bad
in case
impulses, but
Scott wants to say something. The other thing that I say, yeah, you say don't data dump. Don't, for me, it's don't stop the narrative to prove how much research you did. I don't care. And for me, the science in my debut novel Triptych, the time travel mechanism doesn't matter. It works. That's the important part of the whole story. So I made a point of making a device with the big red button on it. How does the time travel work? Well, you press the button and they travel in time. You don't need anything more than that. Yes, Scott.
Yeah. I was just going to say that one of the writers I admire very much, who manages to do both exhaustive research and then insert the fruits of that in ways that that just feel brilliant and not tedious at all, is S.M. Sterling. When he does his alternate history, he will do a data dump cleverly disguised as, say, one of the viewpoint characters looking at a painting, and I mean, it's natural. There would be a painting here. And so naturally they think about the subject of the painting, which lets us into the universe, or a piece of music, or a meal, and the dishes that are served and how they are different in his timeline than they would be in our timeline, and we get hints of why. And it is scattered, it really serves the function of a data dump, but it is scattered so throughout, and you get so much sensory input that it doesn't feel like you're being lectured to. It feels like, wow, what a rich world. And I see so many, there are so many fantasy worlds that are completely devoid of art, cuisine, music, that, and it's like, what a missed opportunity. And I've learned so much. I mean, he's one of the authors I've learned so much from about how to do this.
Yeah, well, and just going back to what I was saying about where I do the big 60 slide thing, like 20 of those slides are about the arts, because, hey, we're stuck in a pandemic doing a Zoom virtual convention about literature. Art and literature has kept us all sane. It's a massive part of everybody's lives. You can't not think about how art affects and reflects a society that you're building. Bud, you're looking very thoughtful.
Yeah, I disagree with the statement that keeps us all sane. We weren't sane to begin with. We wouldn't be in the business if we were sane.
Writers don't count. Writers don't count.
Writers
don't like to say
yeah,
it.
Right.
Please.
Yeah, I think one of the things I use Scrivener for everything, and I have in my research file, I have files for this, that, and the other thing in there, names, music, etc. Anything that I need. And as I building this narrative, I say, well, I need to talk about such and such, and I'll put a note in that research folder to develop that idea along which will later come into the story, perhaps, or serve as a source for something that happens in the story. But basically, organization is the thing. I have never written a story that I didn't end up shifting the scenes around all the way up to the 4th or 5th revision, and probably rewrite the last scene right before it goes into submission.
I think that's a great thing. I love Scrivener. I've been a beta tester since 0.9. I absolutely love it. And I think that was an excellent point to bring out, that you do need to have some sort of organization, just like she has her 60 slide presentation, her PowerPoint. I think that's also really good advice. Some way that you can keep yourself organized, that you can find things very quickly. And because that's a lot to remember. I mean, sometimes, how many times have you read a story where the characters' names changed and not even the editor figured it out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm also watching here. Go ahead and with your conversation, and I'll keep track of the chat. So please continue.
Oh, I was just, so for those of you who don't have the chat open, I just put a little blurb about what Scrivener is in case you were wondering what it is. I do like my 64 slide thing, and then I import that all into Scrivener because I use Scrivener as well. I write like a Jenga tower, so it's nice to have the ability to do that.
Yeah, I'm pretty old school. I just use Microsoft Word, but I've done I sort of do a double outline model where I will outline the whole novel, and then before starting each chapter, I'll go into a detailed outline of that, and then slam through it.
Yeah,
and that's just an interesting question. How many people are pantsers versus plotters?
Oh, I'm definitely a plotter for novels, even most short stories.
Jamie, Todd Rubin, and I used to do a presentation at cons, plotters versus pantsers. And what we discovered in talking to each other is that we both use the same tools, but we use them in very different fashion in this. And we played off against each other through for the person. Made a nice 1-hour presentation, which we did about 3 or 4 times, I think.
I'd say I'm a plantser. So I was a pantser, and then I got a 6-book deal, and I couldn't be a pantser anymore because you have to, not only do you have to 3-act structure a book, then you have to 3-act structure a whole series as well. So there was a lot of planning that had to go into that. So I find that I do a lot of planning in terms of the culture in the world and kind of where the narrative is supposed to go. But generally, I write the first chapter, I write the last chapter, because I find that I can't draw my bow unless I know where the target is. And then I kind of pants from there. So I'll stop and plan what I need to plan. But like the idea of what Scott was saying about like the really detailed outline, I think I got hives. I was like, no, I can't do that. I need the joy of discovery while I'm writing.
I went on a sailing trip with a bunch of friends. We were delivering the boat to a yard, and he had a detailed sail plan drawn up as where we would be at what hour, what we would do, what we'd have for dinner, and so forth and all. And after we shoved off and got about 100 yards off away from the dock, we took the plan, threw it overboard, and opened the beer, and had a hell of a good time.
Yeah.
I think the truth is that most of writers are both pantser and planner.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to get an idea, and I'll write 1,000 words. Just get it right off the top of my head. Pure pantser. Just write 1,000 words, and then I'll break that down into scenes, and then I'll take those scenes and say what's missing, what order should they be in? Is there a plot somewhere? Well, I need to put this in. I need to put this in. And you add scenes and so forth. And from that point on, you're sort of planning it, but you're not really planning it in detail, like Scott says. You're just saying, let's have a scene for, a romantic interlude here. Okay, boom, that's it. And then you go on. You'll write that later when it comes naturally out of the narrative.
You and I are the same person there, bud. I think I plants the exact same way.
Yeah, but you write novels.
So I plants for 130,000 words. Scott?
Yeah.
Well, even I tend to consider myself a pretty hardcore plotter. But I mean, I've certainly been, halfway through or even all the way through a novel, and then, on the second revision or about, 10 chapters and go, oh shit, that's wrong. I need to go back and do this totally differently. We're not gonna, we're gonna rip that chapter 3 out, and we're gonna have something else happen there because that's boring, and this is much more exciting.
Yeah.
I mean,
And also characters develop, as you were just saying, because if you have your arc and you have your plot points, but when you really start getting in there and your characters really develop, and like I said, I'm a character-based writer, then they sometimes will say, no, I'm not doing that. And they will come up with a better answer than you had.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's, so I think it's important to have that room. And so I do agree with Bud that it's kind of a mix. And that's how I do it. I tend to have the arc, plot for a third, write it, and see what I actually got. And then I plot the rest of the way.
Yeah. But we're kind of getting off the topic of world building.
Absolutely.
This is
So
much
world building.
interesting.
So everybody over there in the chat, I see that the chat's lively. Does anyone in the chat have a question right now?
The question was answered. They were asking about what's a planter, and also they're just singing the praises of Scrivener. So
Yes.
right for right now. So world building. Let's get back to world building. Anybody have any questions for that?
No world building questions? Okay.
Well, I think one of the things that bothers me about some fantasy novels, you have these guys running around with swords and horses, and you rarely ever see a farrier or them an iron mine or smelters or any of the technology that must take place to build a real sword.
Mhm.
And get the horse. Who makes the saddle? You know, it's more than just throwing a blanket over the damn horse and jumping on. You have to have all kinds of equipment. How do you steer the horse? You know, there's no steering wheel behind the ears. Although that'd be an interesting story.
Well, that's actually one of the reasons, Bud, that you just brought up, that I wanted to do this novel about a veterinarian. I mean, whoever keeps the horses healthy, whoever keeps and if you think of a fantasy world, is like, okay,
keeps the
it's time
dragons
to do
healthy?
surgery on the dragon. The dragon has a blocked gut. Good luck.
I think Naomi Novik did that.
And I mean, that's what my first story is about. It's like, hey, the dragon ate a knight in shining armor. Guess what's stuck in the gut?
Yeah, that's a hemorrhoid case for you.
Yeah. So there's that.
One of the points I think that we need to work is, how does world building and scene building work together?
Right.
Because you don't need to introduce the entire terrain, the entire environment of the planet in chapter 1. You need to spread it out all over the whole thing. You may not even talk about the planet at all until the 3rd scene or 5th scene or whatever. And the story has its own organic. I feel like building a short story is like a short concert piece. You have a refrain that you've got to play, and you've got to hit the point. So your story doesn't progress from time A or point A to point Z. You know, it's zigzagging all over the place. The story might require you to do a little forechatting. You need to do a flashback here and there, and so forth and all. So it's mixed up. And you've got to kind of move the pieces around until it feels right, has the right rhythm to it.
Yeah.
You always want to pair tragedy with humor side by side, because each will emphasize the other.
Yeah. I always, in terms of the world building and going off what you were just saying, Bud, and going off what we were saying earlier about data dumping, I like to spool it out, just a little bit here, a little bit there, a phrase here,
Yes.
A dish there. But the thing that I find that when people data dump and when people culture dump, like Tolkien will do, or, in Dune and those books, I personally, as a reader, I found it very insulting, because I felt like the author didn't trust me to be smart enough to pick up the clues that they were laying down. And that's a big thing when I mentor writers. The big thing that I say is, trust that your audience is clever enough to understand the meaning of what you're putting on the page. And just, honestly, just take for granted that these are readers and they read a lot. And if you put the clues on the page the correct way, they'll get what you're saying. You don't have to stop and baby them.
And plus,
Well, you're
they
not
enjoy
wrong.
it.
Sorry.
That's what they're fun. That's the fun part as a reader. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're going to say something. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, that's okay. I think we might have cut each other off there. But I was just going to say, of course, there is a double-edged sword to that, because I've certainly been at the points where I've thought, like, oh, I don't want to insult my reader's intelligence, and the beta readers come back with, dude, I have no idea what you're what? It was like, so it's
But that's what
easy
a
to
beta
fall-
reader's for. That's what that process is for, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to fall back into the, do you understand the words coming out of my mouth?
Well, Noah Lukeman, a famous, well, he was an editor and then he became an agent. He has a shorthand he calls RUE, resist the urge to explain. If you have this fantastic show and you were talking about, somebody explaining a painting, I'm not explaining you a culture, I'm explaining living in this world. So there's a difference. And so you don't explain it, you show it and you let them live it. And so that really reflects back to Scott, what you were saying about ISM Sterling and his work, because you give them experiences in the world. You don't tell them about the world, you let them live it in the world with you. That's the way to do it. We got some questions coming up.
One of the things that always fascinates me is the fact that you can drop a small fact in the first scene.
Mm-hmm.
Never mention it around. And around scene 50, you have to use that fact. And the readers can keep track of this somehow. And I don't quite understand how they managed to do that without rereading or going back and saying this. And resisting the need to explain it again, kills the story.
Absolutely. Actually, it's Stephen Gould, who was the president of SIFWA for a while. He likens it to a backpack in which you pick up shiny rocks. These little details that are important. They're really shiny little rocks or this cute little stick or this shell, and you put it in the backpack. And as an author, you have to be careful not to give them too many rocks, too many shiny pebbles, because if the backpack becomes too heavy, they'll set it down and walk away. So that's his metaphor that I like very much, that these little shiny details, you may have 1,000 as an author, but it's the one or two that you put in chapter 1, as Bud was saying, that you don't use until chapter 50. But guess what? That was that shiny little jewel that they really liked, and they're very glad they put it in their backpack.
Mm-hmm. So, questions?
We've got 2 of them so far that we haven't responded to yet. Do you often read about past cultures and strongly borrow elements to make your own? Is the first question. And then the second question is, how do you maintain consistency over time?
Let's do the first question first then.
Yes. First question to repeat so everyone understands. Do you read about past cultures and strongly borrow these elements to make your own?
Yes, because if it works, it works. So why not? I might not put it in an identical kind of culture, but if I read about a really cool thing, I might put it in one of my own cultures because somebody made that up. It's a thing that cultures actually do. Why not take it? Having said that, one must not be appropriative. Right. So clearly, I'm not going to take something strongly Jewish and put it into my fantasy world whole hog because A, I'm not Jewish, and B, that's me stealing something. If there's a cool moment or a cool thought or a cool concept, sure, but I'm not going to steal an entire ceremony or an entire thought process from a culture, and specifically not a living culture.
Yeah, I think that was the key word, by living, because if you're studying ancient culture, we're not even sure that we got it right. This is what we think they thought. And so in fact, you may be borrowing something that's just an interpretation of a modern scholar, not even really what happened back then.
Yeah, or the interpretation of a scholar from the Middle Ages who was interpreting the brass age. You don't know how. It's like the Bible. Those aren't the words that were written down. Those are a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation, right?
Exactly. Scott, you wanted to say something?
I was going to say that I'm more likely to borrow elements of history than probably culture as such. For example, I did a lot of research for one story about, what was the Vietnamese Empire like in the 19th century? What was the German Empire like in the 19th century? And one of these became a character I really liked, a black soldier of the German Empire. It wasn't terribly uncommon for that, to happen in the German colonial territories, and so, that was because I speak German, it was really interesting to take this character who is not German in culture as such, but is perfectly willing to learn that language as a key to his own advancement, and ends up fighting in the Empire of Vietnam in the late 20th century. So, I'm sorry, no, not late, early 20th century. Yeah. So that was something that I found fascinating to research.
And Bud, did you have something you wanted to say to add to that?
I was reading the questions over here on the chat thing, seeing if we missed anything.
Do you borrow anything from past cultures, Bud?
I just make shit up.
Excellent.
Here's the problem is if I'm writing along and I suddenly come to a point where I need to know the Kelvin temperature of a class 2 star, I say I can't proceed without knowing that fact. So I immediately go to Google and I start searching it through there, the astronomy database and so forth. And 45 minutes later, I'm looking at a cat in a box from Japan and wondering how the hell did I ever get here?
Research hole.
Yeah, no, in reality, when I write hard science fiction mostly, and when I need science in there, I just make something up. I might know a little bit about it, a tiny bit of it. So I'll take that and I'll expand on it a little bit. When I get to the third rewrite, I'll do the actual research into that to find out what the true science that needs to go in there, and then bend the story a little on each side of it so that fits. So I'm still on solid ground, but I'm not on solid ground in the first and second draft. Not by far.
Do you do that thing where you put brackets in? I always write, and then I put brackets, research something cool, put it here, bracket, and then I just keep telling the story.
I just put bracket TBD.
Yeah.
Very good.
Let that get in the way of the momentum.
You don't get you need the flow.
Yeah.
And then the next question we have is, because we got a couple more, what about consistency in a world over a series?
Well, I have that packet of slides, and I think we've all established, except for Scott, we work in Scrivener. So the nice thing about Scrivener is you can just duplicate the file and then wipe the manuscript and start the second book in the series. And then, having done the 4-book series and the 2-book series, my editor has a wonderful document for fact checking. So every once in a while, I'll get an email saying, why are the villain's eyes blue? Weren't they black last book? So I try to keep track of all that stuff as much as possible. I also have, I don't know if you guys can see, here's my mess. I keep notes. I have whiteboards. The whole wall over here is a whiteboard wall. So I write down anything that I think is something that I'm going to need in a future book, like pet names, beverage preferences, anything that I think might come back in the series or that I'll need, or basically anything where I think the readers are going to nitpick me on it. It goes up on the wall and it stays there until the series is done, years and years.
I wrote a series of stories for analog novellas and novelettes mostly. Called Sam Boone, who's an intergalactic confidence man, for lack of a better word. And I didn't pay a lot of attention to consistency. And I went to ReaderCon. First time I went to ReaderCon, I had somebody say, I wrote this series called Sam Boone, and somebody says, well, in such and such a story, in the second scene, did he really? And I go, oh God, people are actually reading this stuff. And I never wrote another piece.
Oh.
It just scared me so much.
The other tip is that I reread the final version of the book that came before it before I start writing the next book. We all hate our books by the end, by publication time, or we all hate our stories by publication time. But I make a point of rereading that thing before I start the new book in the series.
Paul Levinson has a comment about that, is novels are not finished. They're just abandoned.
Yeah.
We're pulled from our screaming hands.
Scott, you had something you wanted to say?
No, I was just laughing about
Okay.
about the novels, and also the part about hating your book, because I'm about to dive into what's probably the fifth revision of my first novel. This is the first one that's actually going to be ordered, which means it's progress. But I mean, it's just oh, good Lord.
Yeah, I have an Excel spreadsheet that I use. That was before Scrivener. I used Excel before
Oh,
Scrivener.
yeah.
And so I have these old Excel spreadsheets that for the older stuff. And I still have to go. I suppose I could convert them and put them in Scrivener, but I'm too lazy.
Yeah. I was just going to say draft 64.
Oh, Lord.
The one
Okay.
you buy is draft 64.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it is hard to remember sometimes when you do change something for a reason and you're like, oh, I changed it for a reason. Why?
Yeah.
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 Yeah, well, I was going to how do you maintain consistency in the world over a series? I think it's important that generally I have a few just a few basic underpinnings of the world that sort of are fixed points. Like, for example, in the book I was just talking about, we're at about a Revolutionary War technological level. There are guns, but overall, they are single shot, takes you at least 20 seconds if you're really good to reload your gun. That's not going to change in the course of the novel. All the other technological, innovations are going to be around that era. And I've seen some fantasy authors who it's like, they've got technological developments that should never be there. It's the Star Trek sort of, hey, we invented this new thing and we're totally going to ignore the implications of it. Like, oh, you mean that part where you hack the transporter so literally nobody ever has to die again? And nobody ever thinks about that.
Right.
And that's another one of my pet peeves is like, please, yes, there are some weird things in technology, and no, it doesn't have to follow the timeline we know exactly, but there are reasons that you do not have internal combustion engines in the Roman Empire.
There's no gasoline. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
I mean,
No, that's perfect. I really like that. It reminds me of Ted Sturgeon's Ask the Next Question, because I find that a lot of stories, you just ask the first question and they don't go past that. And that's where they run into trouble. You need to ask the next question, the question after that, and so on. And I think that's a really good point.
blurring with nodding about that. Yes.
Yeah. What's the
There's no
cultural?
road.
Sorry, Bud, go ahead.
The reason there's no cars in the Roman Empire is because the roads were terrible and there weren't any filling stations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, like, if anytime you build a technology or you build a magic system or anything like that, if you have this specific kind of magic happening or this specific technological marvel happening, you do have to ask yourself, what's the implication of this thing? How does this invention change and affect the culture around us? Because you can imagine if televisions never worked, if somebody invented something else, a scrying mirror, magic was discovered and they invented scrying mirrors instead of televisions, then we wouldn't have smartphones. You can have talking dragons in your fantasy world, but what does it mean when you treat that race of sentient creatures who can think like slave labor? That's what's so great about the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik is it's set in a world where, yeah, there are dragons and yeah, they can talk and yeah, they can think, and it's like Smaug and all those great dragons of literature. And then what happens when the dragons say, no, wait a minute, we want emancipation.
Right.
So whatever cool element you're introducing into the world, ask the next question. Figure out how that particular moment and that invention is going to domino effect. couple.
I've read a lot of slush, and I run into stories that have a fantastic novum, but it doesn't work because they'll do something like, oh, you can read minds. Well, if you can read minds, there's no such thing as passwords, and they'll have somebody with a password in the story. And like, if you're reading minds, you can't have a password.
Yeah.
And so that's a perfect example. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
We do have a question, and that is, do any of the panelists create languages for the worlds? And if so, how do they do that?
I created a language for Triptych, and I only needed about 5 or 6 words in the alien language. So they're all grants that I applied for. OSAP, SHIRK. If you're Canadian and you're in the humanities, you're laughing right now because you know what those are. But I just grabbed random words that worked. For the Skylark series, I wanted something that was, I just needed a couple words for that too. So when you, again, going back to a sociological viewpoint for language, children, the first, I'm trying to think of syllables that babies usually say are like ma, 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 da, da, da. So when you look at languages, the word for mother and father is usually mama, papa, the kinds of words that babies make. And in every culture, it tends to be a high inflection for an affirmative and a low inflection for a negative. So I was just kind of looking at all of those sorts of cultural patterns in language and then just putting together nonsense syllables that babies would use to try to indicate those words.
I tend to do it with
the
go ahead,
editor
please.
of Analog, was great at making up languages. And he made up some, I forget what the story was, but he had it. And he had the copy editor come back to him and say, you said such and such and spelled it so-and-so. No, the correct spelling should be this. And it looked at the general language as a whole thing and said, extrapolating from what you've got here, this doesn't fit in there. So you have to go back to the consistency.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And if you're talking about an alien, in fact, the story that's in Amazing, the reason why I was invited to come here, my story is about a little girl talking to an alien, and they realize the only way they can communicate is through story, it is through song, and that it's actually thematic music, and that's how they communicate to each other. So again, the word language is, are you talking about, human language, or are you talking about the concept of communication? Because the story that I actually have in Amazing, like I said, is how a little girl talks to an alien is through an iPod, through music selection.
Cool.
And
so I think I like the idea of language being much broader. So that's how I approach it. How can you communicate with something that doesn't have a voice box?
Mm-hmm.
At one point, I made up an alien race that communicated in flashes of light. So the only way they could talk to humans was through sign language, because both species had hands and eyes, but one species didn't use modulated sound waves and the other one didn't use modulated light waves for language. But I mean, when I actually try to make a spoken language, and yes, somebody just commented that's a big rabbit hole, and it can be. Oh, good Lord. So yeah, I mean, one of the books I'm working on now has got an ancient language that is used only for invoking magic. And I have a grammatical structure. I pretty much stole the hell out of Russian and German for a lot of the vocabulary and the grammatical structure and the inflection. And one of the easiest ways for me to keep it in my head is to essentially use a real language but screw around with the phonemes so that the words sound, they sound different, but in my head they're the same words, so it makes sense.
Yeah. The other trick, that what you said about the magical language reminded me that I created a magical language for the fantasy series too. And the way I used that was, and then he said the magic words. And then the thing happened, moving on. So I basically cheated. There's a whole other language out there but I never put it on the page because it's like the time travel device. All it has to do is function. It doesn't have to be a big teachable moment. So that's, I mean, if you want to have a foreign language in a book, you can say, I think she said yes, or like, you don't have to actually put that language on the page. And that gives your readers delight space and imagination space and fan fiction space. They can imagine what the magical language sounds like instead of having to figure out what you've put on the page and how that sounds.
One of the big mistakes that a lot of writers make is that saying that language has equivalence. That is, words are units in there. And this is not true. It isn't even true here on Earth. We have some words in other languages. There's no English equivalent to it. The point being is that the cultural background dictates what the language is saying. And you have, if they don't have the same cultural background, they may say something identical to what you hear, and you hear one thing and they're talking about something completely different.
Color is a really good example. If you in translation work, there was a panel here that was on translation, and so I have a question actually for Scott, and that is, if you're using if your language is based on German and on Russian, if you get translated to German and Russian, what do you think is going to happen to your language?
It's going to be far enough away from the real thing that I don't consider, like I said, it only sounds like German and Russian in my head, but that's because I know all the transpositions that I went through. If you, I mean, I don't think a Russian speaker would go, oh, that sounds like Russian. No, it doesn't. Not anymore. Not after I'm done with it.
Okay.
So we've got 3 minutes left, and I think we should probably just wrap up. So if everybody wants to do like last minute plugs, tell us where we can find you on social media, type it in the chat space, tell us what you're working on next, sell yourself, go.
I'm mostly short story writer, so I'm all over the place. You just kind of have to look for it. I do have a collection out that's from Amazon, from all my stories that I got my rights back to. So if you want to try me from Amazing. If you like my kind of stuff, then you can look me up. But like I said, I'm mostly short story, and I'm working on a novel, but it's not done yet.
You can find me at budsparhawk.com or look me up on the Wikipedia, and they have a complete list of all my works on there. So good luck in finding some of them.
I've got my current bibliography up on my blog and webpage. It's called gscotthuggins.com. So there's a bibliography with all the stuff that's out right now.
Great. And you can find me at jmfrey.net. All my social media is in the footer on that page, or it might be at the top of the page because my web designer is literally in there right now flipping some things around, but it's there, it's on the main page. I've also put the link for anyone who wants that deck I've been talking about. You can download it for yourself and use it for your own world building if you like. I also do a world building workshop class. If you live here in Toronto, just get in touch with me and we can arrange a workshop together. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for everybody who asked questions. Thank you to Ira and Steve and everybody at Amazing Stories Magazine for helping us, or for putting this convention together. And everybody have a wonderful weekend.
And thank you.